Hello, everybody, and happy 2025. I hope that this year is better than last. We'll see. So far, for me, it's been full of illness and other misadventures, but things finally seem to be slowing down and getting under control. So, reading wise, things have been pretty good. This month, I am focusing on the Aurelium Reading Challenge for the spring of 2024 semester. So, if you're new, the Aurelium Reading Challenge, I will post a link below, but basically it is sort of a fantasy challenge where you create your own character, and then choose a class, and they go to this magical school, and the different classes have to do with different books that you need to read, or different types of books. So the first book I read for that challenge was God Killer by Hannah Kaner, and this is a pretty short fantasy book. I believe it is part of a series, though. This one was for the animal studies class this semester. The focus is pebble ducks, and the prompt was to read a book with a yellow title. So this book was fine. I was able to finish it. I think I gave it 3 stars, but it didn't really blow me away. I think I was just bored for parts of it, and I didn't feel like very attached to the characters, but it also wasn't the typical setting that I generally enjoy in books. I did think that some of the lore and world building was kind of interesting. So this book takes place in a sort of typical, what you might think of with a D&D type fantasy world, where there's taverns and knights and kings and all that kind of stuff. But in this world, there are gods. The gods are not like typical gods that live in the heavens and control from up above. They are sort of these spiritual beings that are actually brought into the mortal realm by humans creating shrines for them, writing them prayers, offering sacrifices that can bring one of these gods into existence. And some of the gods have more power than others, and if the god is killed, and they can be killed with a certain material, and their shrine is destroyed, then they will disappear from the earth, but they can be brought back. So basically, there was this really terrible war that happened where some of the gods ended up killing a bunch of people, basically, is the simple version of it, and the current king of this realm decided to ban gods. So he has hired some people they call god killers to go and find these shrines and find these gods and kill all of them because they think they're too dangerous. So one of our characters is a god killer. One of our characters is this 11 or 12-year-old girl who has found herself sort of attached to a god of white lies. And by attached, I mean they can't go more than a certain distance from each other. And he doesn't seem to have a shrine, so there's sort of a mystery there. And then the third character was, I believe, sort of the right-hand man / best friend growing up of the current king, but after the war against the gods, he basically washed his hands of everything and tried to become a baker and just live a simple life. The 3 characters end up finding their lives intertwined, and it goes on from there. So definitely some of the things about the premise were interesting to me, but I just, like I said, didn't find this a really engaging book, unfortunately. But if it sounds more like your style, then you might give it a try. It is pretty short. the next book I read, I think this was the second one I finished. I finished this yesterday, and this is My Dear Henry by Kalynn Bayron? Not quite sure how to pronounce her name, but it is a Jekyll and Hyde remix, as you can see. So there is this sort of series of books, although each book is written by a different author, called the Remix Classics series, and basically people take classic stories, classic novels, and rewrite them with a more diverse and intersectional interpretation. So this one has the same characters as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I did read, by Robert Louis Stevenson. I read it years ago though, so I don't quite remember all of this, or didn't quite catch all of the similarities, but I recognize some of them. The story is similar in some ways, but the main characters, so the narrator of the original story and the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character, are both teenage black boys living in London, and they're both queer. And pretty quickly in the story, they end up falling for each other. So this book deals with a lot of issues surrounding race, especially in, I believe it's the 1880s that this takes place. It takes place over a few years. 1883 to 85, I believe. So it talks about how it was to be a black queer boy in London at this time, because there were, of course, black people in London at this time. There wasn't slavery, I'm pretty sure, but of course things were still really difficult, and the main character originally is trying to go to medical school, but he's facing a lot of prejudice, a lot of people saying, well, you know, you could be a janitor or help lift the bodies or something, but you can't actually be a doctor. And then of course there's the addition of him falling for another boy. So it was a really interesting take on the Jekyll and Hyde story, and I did think it was interesting how the author talked about her interpretation of the original story as a story about queerness, which I don't know how much the story, I feel like people kind of know the gist of the story, but not necessarily all of the themes, so I don't know if I want to spoil it. But I could kind of see what the author was talking about, and it definitely gave me some things to think about. There's a lot of talk about sort of different parts of a person, and if you're able to separate those parts of yourself, is that, or if you're able to get rid of one part of yourself, is that better or worse? Other than that, I wouldn't say I was blown away by this book. I felt like it was definitely a young adult book, but it read pretty young to me, like an early teenager. So it didn't necessarily have the sort of level of writing style that I was hoping for, but it was still an enjoyable read, an engaging read. The ending was very different from the ending of the original story, which I understand why. I think that people would probably get a lot out of it, but I personally would have liked to have seen the author try to keep it more in line with the original story, and make her interpretation sort of fit to that. But I think that that wouldn't necessarily work with the message that she was trying to send, so I can understand why she did it the way she did. So that was My Dear Henry. And then that one I had read for the prompt of Spells and Incantations, the class Spells and Incantations. The focus for this semester is the Quick Count spell, and the prompt was to randomly generate a number between it was suggested between 5 and 35, I want to say, and the number was 28 for me, and then I had to find a book that had that number of letters, which honestly I was surprised that there was a book in my TBR that had 28 exactly. So My Dear Henry, A. Jekyll and Hyde remix was technically 28 letters, so that's what I used. And then the other book I finished last night for the Conjuration class, Focus Blinding Prism, the prompt was to pick a random color, which was green for me. I chose Jade City by Fonda Lee. I think this book became really popular a couple years ago, but I had sort of gotten it confused with a different book that I thought was more romance heavy, and so I wasn't going to read it, but my boyfriend ended up getting me an ebook version, and I thought I would try it, and honestly, it's kind of a funny experience because I probably would have DNF'd it if I hadn't seen comments from other people that had read the book saying that it got really interesting after about 200 pages, and that the second and third book in the trilogy were even better. So even though I usually only read the first 100 pages of a book if I am thinking I'm not going to finish it, I decided to stick to 210 precisely, and it was true. At around that mark, I was like, okay, I'm hooked. And then by the end, I was reading it all day, like I couldn't stop myself. So it ended up being a 4-star read because of that. And it was a pretty big book. I think it was over 500 pages. So this book it's been compared to The Godfather with magic, but I don't know. I watched The Godfather. I didn't read the book. I was kind of bored by the movie. This book, I ended up loving. I'm actually gonna read the second one. I'm reading it right now, which I think I've said before, but I haven't really been reading series or continuing with series. So to find a book finally that I felt was worth reading the next book in the series was pretty exciting for me. But basically it takes place in a sort of East Asian inspired land where jade can give certain people of a certain race enhanced powers and abilities. I think there are 5 or 6 different abilities, but it's like strength, perception, there's a few other things I can't really remember, but you're basically faster, stronger, you can kind of sense people's emotions, you can kind of sense other people's auras, and do some level of, it's not exactly telekinesis, I don't think, but like blasting people away in fights and things like that. It's a very soft magic system, like it's not really explained exactly how it works, but basically there are certain people of a certain race that are able to use the jade. You have to get a lot of training to use it because it is kind of like a drug in the sense that too much at once can be really bad and have really severe side effects. But they have used this jade to sort of control the city? I'm not explaining well. So in the past, before the book takes place, there was another country that had sort of taken over this country and its people, and I believe the main, the Kikanis, I believe they're called, of our focus country here, were able to use the jade to sort of oust the colonists, the invaders. And now the people who had fought in that war and had successfully ousted the invaders have sort of split up into 2 main clans, and there are a bunch of little clans, but there are 2 main clans that kind of rule this capital city of this country. And they, sort of like in The Godfather or like other mafia stories, they kind of control all the major trading and corporations and things like that in this country, or at least in this city. And the story just kind of talks about a lot of things. It goes over the history that led up to this point. It talks about myths and legends believed by the people, and it has a lot of jumps to different characters' points of view, so it's sort of hard to describe the plot because a lot happens, but we're mainly following the characters of the No Peak clan, which is one of the major two clans, and their relationships with each other, their attempts to keep No Peak clan strong and keep it from being taken down by the other large clan, the Mountain Clan. And I just really got sucked into this world. Originally, I was kind of like, I don't know if I can really relate to any of these characters. I don't know if I want to really read about characters that are just killing people or beating people up because they're not, following the rules, or I don't know if I'll be able to sympathize with any of these characters. But as you get to know them more, you really start to root for some of them and be invested in what happens in their lives. And of course it gets pretty intense and dark, and I can only imagine that the next couple books are going to get even darker, but that's the kind of stuff I like. So I would actually recommend Jade City, even if you're not normally into mafia stories, which I am not. But yeah, just if you can, try to read the first 210 pages, and I think you will be happy. The next book I read was I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson, and this was a fun prompt. It was for my astronomy class. The subject for the semester was Constellations 3, and the prompt was a zodiac recommendation. So basically, the idea was to find a list where someone had written, if you are a Leo or a Sagittarius, if this is your star sign, then these are the books that you would like, and pick one of those books. So I looked at many lists, and this was the one that sounded most interesting for Cancers, which is me, and decided to check it out. So in the end, I liked it. There were some things that I would have done differently, and I think it also was maybe, well, it was definitely written for a younger audience than I. I know that people of all ages can read young adult books and enjoy them, but I think that some of the messaging, or just the way that the characters spoke and thought and acted, was less relatable to me now at the age of 28. Oh my goodness, how old am I? I'm 28. Less relatable to me than it would have been when I was 16 or 13, which is the ages that those characters were. So basically this book is about a family dealing with grief for the most part, and it's also sort of a coming of age story, I suppose. So it focuses on twins. There is, what are the names? Oh my goodness. Jude and Noah. And they are very close. By the first chapter of the book, when they are 13 years old. And then the next chapter is when they're 16 years old, and you can tell that they're no longer close. Something has happened, a lot has happened. Their mom has passed away, their grandmother has passed away, and things are just not right. It seems like everyone has secrets from each other, no one is in a good place. The first chapter, when they're 13, is from the point of view of Noah, And the second chapter, when they're 16, is from the point of view of Jude, and then it sort of alternates back and forth, where the sort of past chapters are always in Noah's point of view, and they go further and further ahead in time until they catch us up to the present chapters, which are always in Jude's point of view. So we're sort of finding out how they got to this point, and then in the present, we're starting from this low point, and then things are changing again. And this book definitely deals with a lot of topics of grief, found family, sibling relationships, complicated relationships with your parents, especially if one parent treats a sibling different or seems to like or get along with a sibling better than another sibling, and how to deal with that. Queerness, Noah is gay, and also just self-acceptance, trying to fit in, growing up, lots of different topics. It definitely does cover some darker themes, or I guess they do talk about sex, and there is some mention of assault as well, and so definitely be cautious of that if that's something that you don't feel comfortable reading about. But I'm saying this to say that even though the characters are as young as 13 at certain parts of this book, it wasn't a middle grade book for sure. It was definitely a young adult, and it had some heavier themes for older teenagers, I would say. But I think that was one of my complaints, was that I felt like it wasn't necessarily written in a more elevated manner, but I think that's just a personal preference. Another complaint was that I felt like the ending sort of wrapped up very quickly, and everyone just all of a sudden became really mature, like everybody. And it seemed a little forced to me, or a little unrealistic, but again, that could just be a personal preference. So overall, like I said, I enjoyed the book. I wouldn't say it was my favorite book of the year or anything. I think I gave it 3.5 stars, and that was I'll Give You the Sun. So I finished a few more books. One was All That's Left Unsaid by Tracy Lien, I believe is how you say it, or Lean, I'm not sure. But that was for the shapeshifting class. The focus for this semester was mimics, and the prompt was to read a book by an author who blurbed my last 5-star read. So I almost never give books 5 stars, because in my head that's perfect, and I don't know that I've ever read a perfect book. I think I've given 2 or 3 5 stars, like, ever, although I haven't been rating books for a very long time. So the most recent book that I had read that I gave the highest amount of stars to, 4.5, was Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John, I think, or St. Mendel, something like that. But her book was only blurbed by news companies, which was kind of strange, like USA Today and stuff like that. So the other recent book that I had read that I had given 4.5 stars to was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, and on her book there were blurbs from other authors, and Tracy Lien was one of them. It focuses around Vietnamese Americans living in, where are they? I can't remember where they are exactly, but living in the US. And this one woman in particular, who her younger brother was just murdered, and she is back home, and she is trying to figure out what happened to her brother, because there are just a lot of suspicious things. He was murdered in the middle of the day at a restaurant, and even though there were other people eating there, everyone says that they either didn't see something, they didn't see anything, they were in the bathroom. The staff were like, oh, we were in the kitchen. So she's trying to figure out what happened. But it's really not, it doesn't feel like the point of it is to be a murder mystery. And that's how the other book by her was that I read as well. Like, there is that mystery and you do find out what happened, but the book itself really focuses more on character development and how characters interact with each other than it does on the actual mystery, if that makes sense. So I believe it takes place in 96, and there's just a lot of discussion around how it is to grow up as an Asian American, especially a Vietnamese American. Some of the characters were born and spent some time in Vietnam before their family fled to the US. I think most of the characters, if not all, that were from Vietnam, they were sort of refugees and had really traumatic experiences back in Vietnam. And so it's really talking a lot about that, trying to fit in or trying to figure out who you are, being raised between two worlds, and also just about growing up. There are flashbacks to our main character's time in high school with her best friend, who is also Vietnamese American, who had sort of some really rough stuff that was going on at home, and they were super close for years, and then something happened, and now they're no longer friends, and so you're also figuring out what went on there. I just really love books that explore a character or characters and their relationships with each other, that go really in depth into conflicts and longing and shame and just family dynamics and everything like that. So this book definitely delivered on that front. Would definitely recommend. Another book that I read was, actually, let me explain the situation first, because this technically doesn't fit the prompt, but I used one of my cheats, I suppose, that I earned from the guild reputation points I had saved up. So originally the book was going to be The Lying Game by Ruth Ware, because the class was Art of Illusion, the prompt, or the subject was shadow play, and the prompt was read a book with the word game or play in the title. And The Lying Game was one of the only books, if not the only book, in my to-be-read list that had game or play in the title. But I could not find this book anywhere. It wasn't on Libby, and it wasn't at the library. And I needed to read this other book for the Carlsbad Book Club. So one of my sort of powers in this readathon I'm doing is that once a semester I can read a book that doesn't have to do with the prompt, basically, but still count it. So I read The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. This is a nonfiction book, which was nice, because I don't read a lot of nonfiction on my own generally, at least not front to back. Like, I may skim through and look for certain sections, like in reference books, but I appreciate having that encouragement to read more nonfiction. And this one is basically Sarah talking about her family and her life growing up in New Orleans East specifically, which is an area that often you won't find on maps or travel vlogs or books, because it sort of has a reputation for being the more poor or run down part of town. a lot of African American people lived there. It got seriously destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, and she was in her early 20s when Hurricane Katrina hit, so she actually talks about the first, like, third is about her family before she was born, and then she kind of talks about her childhood and then everything, her adulthood with the events of Katrina and how her family dealt with it and things like that. She has a huge family. I believe she has, oh gosh, does it say? She has siblings in the teens, I believe, 12 or 14 siblings. And she interviewed them for this book. So that was really interesting as well, because she talks about at the beginning how some of her relatives were like, you shouldn't publish these events about our family. Some things just shouldn't be shared or talked about. She didn't go super in depth into that conversation, but I did think it was an interesting discussion. But yeah, the Yellow House is what she called the house that she and all of her siblings grew up in. It was where she lived in New Orleans East, and it was devastated, completely destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. So she kind of uses it as a focal point to talk about growing up there and all the different things that she and her family members went through. There is a lot of love in this book. There's a lot of introspection by herself and different characters, or, you know, her, I guess they're characters, but even though they're real people. And history as well. It was really eye-opening to see how it was to grow up in New Orleans pre-Katrina, and she went back after the hurricane. And it read really smoothly. I was never bored. There were never any parts that felt dry or stale, which sometimes happens to me when I read nonfiction. She has a really great voice, and it was a really great time reading about her family and herself, and they definitely go through some hard times, but I think the honesty as well that they have with each other and that she has with her audience was really refreshing. So I really did enjoy this book. I am sorry to say that I used another one of my sort of bonus skills or powers to DNF a book, and that is Jade War by Fonda Lee. So I know I told you all that I had read Jade City and I loved it. By the end, I had to read over 200 pages to really get into it. This book was for the restoration class, Regaining Consciousness, and the prompt was a book to cure slumps. Reading slumps, like where you just don't feel like anything sounds good and you feel like you really don't want to read anymore. So I thought that was going to be the book because people had rated it more highly than the first book in the series, Jade City, but I was having a similar experience where I had read 100 pages and I was still bored. And I thought about reading to 200 again, but that just seemed like a lot of effort, so I stopped, unfortunately. And then the last book I wanted to talk about is actually not for this reading challenge. It's still under the Aurelium Readathon, but it's for the year in Aldea. Aldea is the world that all of this takes place in, and basically every year there is a challenge where you get one prompt a month and you read a book for that prompt, and it follows some sort of adventure. So for this year, G, the creator, made a really cool map and sort of had it laid out like a board game where each month you decide which way you're going to go on the board, and that'll decide your prompt. So the January book the prompt was to read a book that was published in 2024. And just finished that one, and that was Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. This one, I mean, honestly, I've been reading a lot of really great books this year already, so I feel good about that. Hopefully, either I've been really lucky or I've been better at finding out which books I'm going to enjoy, but I'm not complaining. This book is a mystery, a murder mystery. It follows a character who, when she was in her early to mid-20s, she was living in this tiny town in Texas where she had grown up. She had left for college and then came back, became friends with this girl that was kind of like the typical blonde-haired, was homecoming queen. You know, everyone's like, oh, she's so sweet. Well, that girl ended up getting murdered, and our main character was found down the road from the other girl's body, covered in blood, and claims not to remember anything. So, it is from our main character's point of view, and she does say throughout the book that, like, she doesn't remember anything. She doesn't even know if she actually killed her friend. She doesn't think she did, but she really doesn't know what happened. The police said that there wasn't enough evidence to convict her, but everyone in the town, pretty much, even her own parents, kind of decided that she was guilty, and she ended up leaving again. She lives in LA now, but this podcaster who kind of reminded me of Serial or other true crime podcasts, he's decided to make a season surrounding her story, and so everyone's all abuzz about it again. And at the same time, her grandmother, who is kind of the person in her family that she's closest to, her grandmother's birthday is coming up, and so her grandmother, who still lives in the hometown, is like, you need to come and celebrate my birthday with me. And of course the podcaster is there as well, snooping and sleuthing. So things sort of unravel from there, and of course we find out what happened. So I've actually read other books where there was a podcast element. You know, I wouldn't say that a lot of the ideas themselves were that new, but at the same time, I think one of the things that pushed this book into 4-star territory for me was how funny it was, which I was not expecting, because it does cover some really dark topics. Like, I would definitely look up the trigger warnings, and they're not making light of those topics, but the main character and her grandmother especially, just, they're so sarcastic, and their sense of humor is just hilarious, and I found myself actually laughing out loud, which I don't do often with books, or maybe I will once or twice, but I was laughing out loud like every chapter of this book. I don't know that that's ever happened to me with a murder mystery before, so I really wasn't expecting it, but I really loved it. It was also great having grown up in Texas, reading about Texas culture and these sort of stereotypical characters. But I did hear that the audiobook is really great. It's almost every other chapter, I feel like, there will be a section from the podcast. And so I bet it's great if they have, I'm assuming that they have different voice actors for different characters on the podcast. So if you're into audiobooks, that's probably the way to go. I prefer to read books physically, and so when I saw that this was at the library, I decided to do it that way. But yeah, that's Listen for the Lie. The last book that I read for January was Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang, and that book actually served two purposes. I used it for my last required class for the spring equinox of 2024. That class was Elemental Studies. The focus was Call Lightning, and the prompt was to read a book with a source of light on the cover. So I don't know if it was a stretch or not, but I figured, you know, fire emits light, so it counts. But the original reason that I chose that book was because I'm a member of the Patreon for Book Roast, which is the platform that I do the magical, that I participate in the magical readathon through. The creator of Book Roast, G, she's the one that also created the magical readathon, and so as part of the Patreon, there is a monthly book club pick, and Blood Over Brighthaven was the pick for January. So I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I had heard about it before, but it hadn't really caught my attention, so I'm glad that I had a reason to pick it up. This book is another one where it's sort of hard to explain some of the things that make it really good without spoiling, so I'm going to do the best I can, but it is a fantasy that takes place in another world that sort of feels like a Victorian England, and there is magic. There are mages that perform magic. The way they do it is through a sort of, they're called spellgraphs. It's hard to explain, but it's sort of like a typewriter with a attachment on top that you can see sort of blurry images through. And so you kind of type the spell out on the typewriter, and there's other stuff that goes into it. They explain it in much detail. So that's how the magic system works in this book. The main character is a young woman who has been studying her whole life to become one of the high mages. The thing is that there have never been any high mages in this city, and any female high mages. I don't know if I said that, but she's trying to become the first one. There is a lot of sexism in this city, and it's tied up in religion. It is a city that, it's sort of a theocracy, I suppose. I mean, it is a theocracy, but the religion is also tied up in science and magic. So one of the sort of core religious beliefs is that women just are too sensitive, not intelligent enough to be high mages. So that's kind of where we start the book, is with her trying to become a high mage. But things start to take a very different direction about a third of the way through the book, I want to say. There's just a whole other element that comes up. Things I can say without spoiling. So another thing about this city is that it is an isolated city. The world that our characters live in is, as far as we're told, very inhospitable. It's a very cold place, and the mages of the city, I believe 300 years ago, found a way to basically create a magical barrier surrounding the city that keeps it warm, among other things, but basically makes it a bit of an easier place to live. As far as we know, there are no other cities for who knows how many miles, but no one has left the city in hundreds of years. So the people who live in the city, who were born there and of a certain lineage, are called the Turon. And then there are people who are outside of the city, and they're generally referred to as the Quen, but there are several different tribes and groups of people that obviously have different names for themselves. And the book opens with a group of the Quen trying to get into the city because the outside world has become too inhospitable. There's this sort of disease called blight that has been spreading and just killing indiscriminately, and a lot of their crops have been ruined and things like that. But they find when they get into the city, which this still happens at the beginning, so it's not really a spoiler, but basically there is a lot of racism that is also sort of quote-unquote supported by religion. The Quen people are seen as less intelligent. They are really put below the tyrannish woman. So it's you might be able to see right away there definitely are the parallels between, like, in, I think, at least American U.S. society, if not other sort of Western European societies, this sort of hierarchy of the white man, then the white woman, and then people of color of any gender. And so the Quen people are at the bottom, and they are sort of forced to do the most menial tasks. They are not given great places to live, and if they cannot prove that they can be useful to the city, they will be thrown back out. So that's how we're starting the story. It really is a large commentary on this racial injustice, and how to be a good ally, or it's not necessarily an instruction manual. I suppose it's more talking about a system that exists in the modern world in a different way through the lens of this fantasy world. And yeah, I thought it was really well done. One of my complaints was that the first third or more of the book is very info dumpy. It is so much just teaching you how the spellograph works. It takes up so many pages, and then I felt like they didn't really talk about it much after that. They were focused on more of the action and political side of things, which was fine, but it almost felt like, why did we learn how all of this works if then you're not gonna use that knowledge to boost the action? I don't know. It's a little strange to me, and a little dry. The main character, the female main character, is definitely very self-centered and wants to leave a legacy more than she cares about other people. So she is very flawed, and I kind of liked that you get the sense that the author is not saying that the way she's behaving is okay. And so I feel like there are so many books where the main character is sort of this perfect character that always does the right thing. It's always interesting to me to read books where there's more of a gray character and see their journey that they go through. And I also think that it was a good way to use a character to sort of get certain points across. And so that was Blood Over Bright Haven. Overall, would definitely recommend. And like I said, that was the last book I read in January. So I think I read a lot of good books this month. I'm hoping that that will carry over or that will continue for the rest of the year. Thanks for watching this video, and I will see everybody in the next one.